Applying to a UK medical school that needs the BMAT? Wondering how to get a smashing score? Keep watching to learn more. Hi and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Wesley and I'm a recent secondary school graduate and Cambridge Medic offer holder. If you're watching this video, then you probably already know that the BMAT is an admission test required by some of the medical schools in the UK. Check out my admissions test video for more details about admission tests. And for this video, I'll put links to specifications, study guides, online resources, and past questions in the description box down below. The BMAT has 3 sections. The first is on thinking skills and it lasts for 60 minutes. The second is scientific knowledge and applications and it lasts for 30 minutes. And finally, there's a writing task that also lasts for 30 minutes. The first 2 sections are graded on a scale of 1 to 9. And the essay has 2 score components. So firstly, there's a score for your language and it's on a scale of E to A. And then next, there's a score for your content from 1 to 5. So Cambridge is one of those schools that requires medical applicants to sit the BMAT. So I sat the BMAT in October of 2022 and I got 7.9 for section 1, 6.5 for section 2 and 5A for section 3. It's not an extremely high score as you can see here for the statistics of the same cycle. 6.5 for section 2 is a bit lower than I expected, but I was happy with 7.9 in section 1 and 5A for section 3. As you can see, those 2 scores were kind of in the first percentile. So if you're aiming for a top medical school, then in general, something like a 6.5 or a 7 would be a good score. Thankfully, it was enough for me to get an interview offer, and I'll explain more on that along the way. So section 1 is arguably my favorite section. At first, you might find the questions a bit tricky, and you're not quite sure why that's the answer. There was a time when I got 5 and 6s for section 1, but you get better with practice using the correct strategies. The paper has 32 multiple choice questions and 2 categories. According to the specification, there are 10 question types that will appear in a mix, so you don't do problem solving and then followed by critical thinking. They appear in a random order dispersed evenly. If you do a bit of math, then you'll know that you get a little under 2 minutes for each question, and they are pretty complicated. The trick to doing section 1 is to be systematic. Generalize them according to the different question types, since they recur all the time, and tackle them using systems for each unique type. In today's video, I'll show you a couple of examples, as well as my strategy for completing them. Alright, so let's look at our first example. So this is taken from the 2020 paper of the BMAT, and section 1, question 1. Okay, so the question says that you can only take the practical driving test after passing the theory test, and you have failed the theory test, so you cannot take your practical test. So when I mean by generalizing the question, I mean that you could use symbols instead of the words. So let's take practical driving tests as X and theory tests as Y. And do remember that the order of the objects normally do not change. So in this case, the only way that you can have X is to have Y. Okay, so that's section 1. This is section 1. And then section 2, it says that you have failed the theory test, so you cannot take the practical test. So now, what it means is that there's no more Y, and so there's no more X. Alright, so this is the second component. So when we look at the options over here, we want to be able to identify the objects and then substitute them back into X and Y. If they match this framework, then that's our answer. Alright, so option A says you need to have lived in the UK for 5 years to become a citizen. You have lived in the UK for 5 years, so you will not be refused citizenship. So the first part of the statement seems to match the section 1. However, the second part of the statement seems to be positive, while our statement is negative. So it does not fit the X and Y framework over there. So let's move on to option B. So people who are good at maths are likely to be good at music, and you are good at maths, so you could learn to play a musical instrument. So obviously this is completely different. Even if we do good at math as X and this is Y, it wouldn't work because this is just likely and it's not a causation relationship, and also the second part is also a positive statement. Alright, let's have a look at option C. Pacifists refuse to fight in wars or join armies. You refuse to join wars or join an army, so you are a pacifist. Okay, so here pacifist would be X, and the second object would be Y. However, the first part is already wrong because it uses refuse, so it's negative. Alright, so we don't even have to look at the second part. Now let's look at option D. To enter China, you need a visa. You don't have a visa, so you can't enter China. Alright, so here China is X and visa is Y. Alright, so to enter China, you need a visa. So you need Y to have X. And you don't have a visa, so there's no visa, and hence you cannot enter China. So this matches the framework, and so D is our answer. Okay, now let's look at this other example, which is question 3 from the same paper. Now throughout your exam, you'll find some of these questions with these long paragraphs, and that's actually pretty common, so which is why the time is actually quite tight and you have to learn how to read quickly through the question. Analysis from the Office for National Statistics tells us that income is far less significant for life satisfaction than other things like marital status, having children, and a job. Far from being unencumbered, young, free, and single, it is in fact the binding of ourselves to others through covenants, contracts, and caring responsibilities that provides us with an empowered sense of self. This is hardly surprising. Indeed, perhaps the best evidence of the importance of community to our lives is to be found in how our lives are summarized on our gravestones. Mother of 4 or 60 years married, say our tombstones. Rarely property tycoon or owner of Mazda MX-5 Generation 4. Okay, so here the question keyword is underlying assumption. So what does underlying assumption mean? It means that the conclusion made by the statement has to be formed with the assumption and is not stated in the information given. So let's look at the options. Option A says the reason why people get married and have children is to have an empowered sense of the self. In the given information, it says that these responsibilities provides us with an empowered sense of self. So it seems that what it's saying is that people get married and having children leads to an empowered sense of self. So it's a causation relationship more than the reason. So it's not A. And moving on to B, the only way to achieve life satisfaction is to bind oneself to others. So in nowhere in the question does it say that it's the only way to achieve life satisfaction. It just says that it's less significant, right? So it's not B. And for option C, it says that most people believe that income is what determines happiness. First, let's not think about whether or not that's correct. The problem is whether or not it's an underlying assumption for us to reach our conclusion. And the conclusion in the passage is actually talking about how this binding of ourselves to others, essentially the sense of community, is important to an empowered sense of self. Right? So that's the conclusion. And so whether or not most people believe that income is what determines happiness is irrelevant to the conclusion. And from the information given, we can't define whether or not that's correct. But as an option, that's wrong. And so moving on to option D, the inscriptions on gravestones reflect what people think is most important in their lives. Now this addresses one of the evidence that they use to back up the conclusion. So here it says, indeed, perhaps the best evidence of the importance of community to our lives is to be found in how our lives are summarized on our gravestones, right? So they're using that as a backing evidence. So the author thinks that it's the best evidence because they think that the things that you write on the tombstones are important. And what if this is not true? So if this is not true and the inscriptions do not actually reflect what people think, then this whole evidence would be completely useless. And there would be nothing backing up the conclusion. So this seems like the underlying assumption. So with underlying assumption questions, you want to find the conclusion and look at each of the options to see whether or not that's an assumption that validates the evidence used to back up the conclusion, or whether or not the options back up the conclusion themselves. Okie doke, now let's look at another question, and this is sort of a common one, and it talks about the main conclusion, so identifying the conclusion. So let's read through the question. Everyone with a good idea wants it to have impact. Why do some social innovations go global whilst others remain small scale? Whether the idea is a pioneering schooling model or a new form of volunteering, social innovators must become campaigners and embrace change in order to have widespread influence. Innovators who can campaign for an idea create demand amongst those who might benefit from it or help support it. Being willing to experiment with an idea is also critical. Experimentation pinpoints adaptations needed for innovation to spread beyond specific sets of circumstances. Likewise, innovators must be ready to let their ideas grow beyond their own organizational boundaries. Most social innovations spread through copying rather than through building the social equivalent of big corporations. Okay, so I think most of you will know that the conclusion of a writing usually appears at the beginning or the end of the piece. So at the beginning it starts with a question, so this just seems like an opening line, right? So just a thinker. And at the end it says that most social innovations spread through copying rather than through building the social equivalent of big corporations. Now this is a statement. But is this statement really what the majority of this passage is talking about? So, because in option A, it also says the majority of social innovation spread through copying, which would be this, right? So this is the same. However, when you read through the passage, you find that this is not what the passage is talking about, so not the main idea, and hence this is not an option. Moving on to B. Everyone with a good idea for a social innovation wants it to have impact. So this is the beginning, right? So literally the first sentence. And we've already talked about that in just an opening line. It doesn't mean anything, so that's not the answer as well. And so option C, some ideas related to social innovation are suited only to specific circumstances. Where can we find this? Here, experimentation pinpoints adaptations needed for innovation to spread beyond specific sets of circumstances. So it's talking about experimentation. We just have to look back a little bit. It says being willing to experiment with an idea is also critical. Also critical means that it's not the only point, hence it's not the most important point, so that's not the conclusion. Alright? And it's just used to back up the main idea. So what is the main idea? So let's look at option D. To have widespread influence, social innovators must become campaigners and embrace change. So the first line is a question. So that's a thinker, right? So that's to catch the reader's attention. They really want the reader to think about that. So usually after the question, they start answering themselves. So whether their idea is a pioneering schooling model or a new form of volunteering, social innovators must become campaigners and embrace change in order to have widespread influence. And then they start talking about innovators who can campaign for idea, create demand, and then also being willing to experiment is critical. So everything below that is to back up the previous statement, which is social innovators must become campaigners and embrace change. So that is essentially the main idea, and that is the conclusion. Also, the writer used strong words for this, so pioneering and must become. So those are all strong and very emotional words that's usually used in the conclusion. And looking at E, it also just highlights the question, but it's talking about the most important question is for social innovators to concern why some ideas spread and while other remain small scale. So again, that's just the first line and it's irrelevant. So again, for questions asking you to find the conclusion, read through the passage and make sure that that thing can summarize the passage as a whole. And sometimes they might use stronger language for the conclusion, but that's not a must. So it's better to just look through the options and make sure that the one that you're looking for is the one that addresses the main idea. Alright, so let's look at this final example, and it's question 32 of the same paper. Now this is one of the types of questions that I love the most. And it says a puzzle consists of 4 tiles, all of which have the shape shown below. So it's sort of this Tetris looking T shape. And on each tile, one of the squares is colored black and the other 3 are colored white. No 2 tiles look the same. The back of each tile is gray. Which one of the following patterns can be made by placing the 4 tiles together? Obviously, gray does not appear in any of the options. Hence, this part is completely irrelevant. The rest of the information says that on each tile, one of the squares is colored black and the other 3 are colored white. No 2 tiles look the same. There are exactly 4 squares in one tile, and you need 4 tiles to fill a 16 square pattern, and so that all makes sense. Hence, the available combinations, you can obviously know that it's one of these squares being black. So for these type of questions, you want to visualize them. So first off, I like to start at the corners, option A here. So this black tile is at the corner, so it can either be part of this tile or this tile, right? And we already know that it can't be this option because this tile will have 2 black squares, so that's not it. So let's cancel that out. And so it can either be part of this tile. So then this piece here will have to be part of this tile, right? And then this bit here would be on like the top square of the tile. So all that makes sense till now. And then you'll be left with this bit. But then if you rotate this, so rotate this T shape into this, you find that it will match exactly with this tile, right? And so that's not the option. And then let's look at option B. So again, I like to start at the corners. So we already know it can't be this, so it's that way. All right, so then this will have to be in the middle, this at the top, and then you do have another one with one in the middle. So again, not option B. Let's look at option C. So we know it can't be this, it's this way, but then these two are already stuck together. So that's impossible. Now let's look at option D. So it's not this way, it can only be this way. And then this one in the middle. And then what about this one? So although they seemingly seem to be in the same tile, it's actually like this, right? Because you have to figure out how to fit 2 T-shaped tiles there. And then finally with this one here. All right, so it seems that this one is in the middle, this one is in the bottom left corner on top, and the bottom right corner. So you have to rotate this tile to get it. And so they fit perfectly, and it's option D again. Right, so you just have to be able to imagine what the combinations of the tile is and know when to rotate the tiles and do the rotations quick enough so that you can finish the question in time and do it correctly. As you know, I did the worst in section 2, but that's already a lot better than how I started out. From the Cambridge Assessment Admissions Testing website, the section 2 syllabus sort of follows the GCSE syllabus for physics, biology, chemistry and maths. 27 questions in 30 minutes. And I, for one, did not sit the GCSE and haven't studied physics at all. So I had limited time to study everything using the guides and notes online. The important part about section 2 is that since it's a content-based exam, you should study it like any other academic exam like the A-levels. So again, with my favorite studying structure. Study part of the contents, so maybe a topic within the subject, and then do some bi-topic questions, repeat that until you finish the whole subject, then do subject by subject papers, and then finally do the whole section 2 past paper. The only difference here is that yet again the questions are pretty standard. The section 2 questions aren't exactly hard once you get to know the content, but the problem is the time pressure. You get roughly 1 minute per question and you can't use a calculator for any calculation. So sort of similar to section 1, you have to be really familiar with the question types, and in addition to that you have to practice quick mental math. I'm not going to be walking you through any example questions for section 2, since that would mean having to teach everything within the 4 subject specifications, and that would take weeks if not months. In any case, just stick to clear understanding for concept-based questions and speed from practice for problem solving. Now moving on to the writing task. The essay questions are sometimes medically or scientifically related, but they can also be just general or ethical. The questions usually give you a statement and then asks you to explain the statement or the reasoning behind it, then argue for or against that statement, and finally it asks for a conclusion or whether or not you agree to a certain extent. You're limited to complete your essay on 1 page of an A4 paper and to finish it in 30 minutes. So I would say that you have around 5 minutes to look over the question, pick a question, and then plan out your writing, which includes planning out the structure and content by using things like mind maps or point form. Unless you're a really gifted writer and can form graphical mind maps in your brain, then I really suggest that you plan out your writing before to make sure that your writing is clear and cohesive. Since part of the content score for your writing is given to the fact that you've hit all the points within the question, I usually do 1 short paragraph for the explanation/intro, and then 2 body paragraphs for 2 argument points, and then finally a longer conclusion to take it home. That way I already hit all the points in the question, and I also make sure that my essay is clear and that the structure is smooth. Of course, the majority of the score will be given to how impressive your points are. So just use the 5 minutes to plan out your writing, and so you can make sure that the quality of your points is good enough. Just make sure that your position and points are clear and connected throughout the writing, and that you hit all the prompts in the question. That sort of already guarantees a fair mark. So the most important part for acing the BMAT, in my opinion, is your mentality, which is why I saved it for last. Both your mentality during the preparation and setting the test are equally important. I know there's a lot going on with the A-levels, UCAS, and some of you might even have to sit the UCAT, but time and effort are the only two things that will get you a good grade. So what I did was that I tried to be consistent, and even though I was cramming for the A-levels, I designated Tuesdays as BMAT Tuesdays. And every Tuesday after school, I would save all my time for studying for the BMAT and doing past papers and analyzing the marking schemes. I didn't actually do a lot of BMAT past papers because I had to use a lot of time to study through the physics section, but I'm sure I would have had a lot less progress if I didn't designate BMAT Tuesdays. Some of you might have already heard this story before from my admissions test video, which also goes through some of the general tips for admission tests, but for BMAT I registered it with the same test center for my A-levels, and they were kind enough to help me arrange a schedule clash because on the day I also had 2 other A-level papers, one biology and one chemistry. So maybe it has something to do with that, and I was pretty flustered during the BMAT. Once I finished section 1, my mind was pretty much blank for section 2. So much so that I forgot some of the physics at the time. My point is, make sure that you're well rested and that you're calm throughout the exam. Treat it just like another past paper so that you can reflect your full potential. So that's all for the tips on studying and sitting the BMAT. If you have any other thoughts, ideas, or questions, then pop it in the comments down below. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye!